This video is sponsored by Saili. Over 3,000 years ago, in the Bronze Age Mediterranean, an incredible society built perhaps 10,000 of these stone structures that looked something like medieval castles. Many of them were single stone towers, while others formed extensive complexes with multiple towers, walls and courtyards. But these buildings predate stone castles from the Middle Ages by more than 2,000 years. They were built throughout the era of the Minoans and Mycenaeans. Some were centuries old by the time of Ramses II, and some were still being used when the kings of Rome were overthrown and the Republic established. These structures are called Nuraghi, and they were built on the beautiful island of Sardinia by the culture named after them, the Nuragic Civilization. This society was exceptional, dominating the central and western Mediterranean for centuries through trade and warfare. They may have been one of the groups known as the Sea Peoples, pouring into the eastern Mediterranean in the 12th century BC as the ancient civilizations of the Near East declined and collapsed. But much about these people remains mysterious, not least these sturdy structures that they built in their thousands. Because they look like castles, the first archaeologists to examine them believed they were defensive in nature. They had no doubt that they were Bronze Age castles. However, more recent work has called this interpretation into question, seeing them instead as family homes and impressive status symbols. So who built these structures and why? When did they emerge? How did they develop over time? And what happened to them? This is the incredible story of the mysterious Nuraghi of Bronze Age Sardinia. Sardinia is a beautiful island in the Mediterranean, known for its rugged landscapes and crystal clear waters. Sardinia has a fascinating and rich history. The island's geography features both dramatic coastlines and hundreds of lovely beaches. There's so much history to explore, from the Neolithic and Bronze Age sites to medieval castles, and the island attracts millions of visitors every year. If you're planning on travelling to Italy or to almost anywhere else in the world and you want to ensure you're always connected, then you'll be interested in Saili, this video's sponsor. Saili is a new eSIM service app. An eSIM is a digital SIM that works like a physical SIM card but without having to insert anything into your device. eSIMs help you avoid roaming fees and makes it easy to switch between providers. Download the Saili app on your mobile device and you can choose from several affordable eSIM plans in over 190 countries and 8 regions. With a Saili eSIM, you'll always have a connection when you need it, and you can significantly reduce or even eliminate roaming fees. All Saili eSIM plans are compatible for iOS or Android devices, but if you have any compatibility issues, you can get a full refund. Please hit the link in the description to get an exclusive 15% discount on Saili data plans. Download the Saili app now or go to saili.com/Dan Davis and use the code Dan Davis at checkout. Thank you to Saili for sponsoring the video. The Nuragic culture, or Nuragic Civilization, is the name used to describe Bronze Age Sardinia over the period from about 1800 BC to about 500 BC. The society takes its name from the stone towers they built all across the island, called Nuraghi. No one knows where this name, Nuraghi, comes from. Various etymologies suggest either a Semitic origin from a Punic word from when Sardinia was dominated by the Phoenicians and Carthaginians, or an Indo-European origin via Latin, following the Roman conquest. It could well derive from the Paleo-Sardinian language, which could have come from the languages spoken by the Neolithic people. It's even possible, I think, that it could come from a Bell Beaker culture-derived language, considering this culture arrived on the island just before the first Nuraghi started being constructed. No one knows for sure why the first Nuraghi were constructed, what caused them to be built, and whether they were an independent local development or if they were inspired by migrations onto Sardinia from either Italy or Spain. But we do know the first examples of the Nuraghi appear from around 1800 BC onwards. The first kind are called Proto-Nuraghe or Corridor-Nuraghe because the internal spaces are long and narrow like corridors. They varied in exact form, some are round, others ovoid and some have more rectilinear sides. The thick walls had an outer and inner layer of massive, carefully laid stones, with a rubble and earth core between. Inside the walls were stairways leading up to the flat top, upon which they built wooden structures. The wooden parts don't survive, of course, but there's evidence in the stones for timber uprights that the structures were built from. There are many interpretations for why they were built and how they were used. I've said in a previous video that people didn't live in them all the time because the interior spaces were so confined, and that they were likely temporary refuges or maybe watchtowers. And that could be true. Perhaps people lived in small scattered huts nearby and fled to these structures when raiders appeared. Certainly the thick walls, narrow stairways and small doorways seem to be built with defence in mind. But other people think they were houses after all, inhabited by a family unit. The walls, doors and stairways were simply built that way because of physics. Openings were weak points in the structure, so making them as small and narrow as possible was a way to stop the walls collapsing. Surely though, these people only began building this way as a response to increased physical danger. I mean, it seems that way to me. The next type of Nuraghe to develop after about 1600 BC was the most common kind, the classic stone tower seen in their thousands across Sardinia, the Tholos-Nuraghe. These circular stone towers replaced the flat tops with the timber upper floors with a second or even third story built from stone. In structure, their wide bases, with walls 3.5 to 5 metres thick, grow increasingly narrow as they go upwards and inwards. The diameter at the base could be 11 to 16 metres, while they could be 10 to 18 metres in height. That's 60 feet. The dry stone construction method used is known as corbelling, where each layer of stone protrudes slightly inwards from the one below it. Building this way was developed independently many times, but some argue the technique was introduced to Sardinia from Iberia, mainland Italy or Greece. We don't know for sure. On top of the towers were these small beehive-shaped domes. The tops of all of the many towers have all fallen down now, but we know for sure that they had these domes from the stone and bronze models of Nuraghe that these people made. The domes covered the stairs where they came up to the top of the tower. And incredibly, some of these models even show machicolations, just like much later medieval castles. These were slits in the overhanging corbelled parapets, presumably serving the same purpose as in medieval castles, for dropping stones or shooting arrows down at attackers below. According to most sources, the earliest machicolations appear in Crusader castles in the Middle East, and the concept is then brought back to Europe after 1100 AD. Others suggest they may have been used in Roman-built fortifications guarding the frontier across the Middle East from the 4th century AD. It's speculated the remnants of these Roman forts influenced later Crusader castle design. But in fact, here on Sardinia, they were in use over 2,000 years earlier than that. This little detail just emphasises how ahead of their time these structures were. The first archaeologists to record and interpret these structures, especially the complex multi-tower ones I'll talk about later, described them as proto-castles, and they imagined similar medieval social structures living within them, with aristocratic rulers supported by courtiers and servants, defended by a garrison of men-at-arms, and surrounded by serfs and peasants in the landscape. They thought proto-castles must reflect proto-feudalism. Later archaeologists said that this was inaccurate, and the Nuragic culture wasn't anything like as stratified as medieval societies. And some even argued that the Nuraghe themselves weren't primarily defensive in nature. They believed the towers could not hold many defenders and had little space for stores of food and water in case of a siege. Instead, they said they represented status symbols or were collective community projects. And the truth is, it's hard to know much for sure about the various phases of the Nuragic culture, and there are many possible interpretations of the evidence we have. But it looks as though there was a rapid population expansion after about 1600 BC, so perhaps population pressures increased conflict and fighting over the best locations and resources. And it does seem as though people did live in these towers. Whatever else they might have been, they were also residential. The internal rooms on each floor often have large niches in the walls, but no one knows what they were for. Maybe they were for storage, maybe they had beds in them, and maybe they were for all kinds of things. It's thought that fires lit for cooking and heating in the central rooms could have let smoke out through purpose-built holes in the walls. They've been called exhaust windows, and from slowly filtering out through the stonework. The internal spiral staircases usually start on the left-hand side of the doorways, curving up to the next floor above. Opposite the bottom of the stairways, on the right-hand side of the door, is almost always a niche. The first archaeologists excavating these called them the guard's niche or guard chamber, imagining that it was the station for the man-at-arms on duty, maybe lowering his spear and demanding who goes there when someone approached. The name for the niche has stuck, even though no one believes it was a guard's room anymore. There's no better explanation, however, as far as I know. Maybe it was a cloakroom, where you'd take off your boots and hang up your cloak. Or maybe it was where they kept the weapons, ready to meet an attack from outside. Modern researchers believe these Tholos-Nuraghe were built by petty chieftains or tribal leaders, likely bringing the local community of farmers and herders together to construct them. The geology of Sardinia is highly variable, and they were built in all kinds of landscapes and from all kinds of stone: basalt, granite, trachyte, limestone, schist and sandstone. Generally, most of the stone for them came from within a 200-metre radius, and rarely did it come from over 2 kilometres away. They presumably built curving earth ramps to drag the heavy stones up as each layer was placed. For the upper stories, maybe they just hauled up the lighter stones with ropes. Still, these towers were surely a monumental effort. The knowledge and skills must have been passed down through the centuries, whether through specialist builders or through the community more generally. And they built thousands of these towers. Most of the ones that remain, even in ruined form, are in the highlands and in remote places. It looks like they were most concentrated in the high basaltic plateaus. But it's worth bearing in mind many of the ones in the plains and the more fertile lands were intentionally dismantled in the 18th and 19th centuries to build field boundaries and animal shelters and houses. But wherever they were built, it seems likely they were the strongholds for the thousands of local chieftains and their families, each ruling over a small area as part of a wider tribal network. But then, after about 1350 BC, more complex Nuraghe started to be constructed, with multiple towers, walls and courtyards. These were the incredible structures that really do look like castles. So why were they built, and who built them? We can probably imagine how they developed. All it would take is for some chief to build a second tower next to the one he already had. Some sites added 2 or 3 or more towers around the central one, and they were often linked by walls with walkways on top. These created interior courtyards, and there were even multiple layers of towers and walls. Other sites weren't developed incrementally, but built from scratch as complex multi-tower fortifications. And surely we have to accept that these were designed with defence in mind. Building something like this required an immense sustained effort, and surely gifted architects and builders. The labourers would have needed organising, feeding and paying in some form. There had to have been a massive community endeavour. What stimulated the building of these is hard to say. Perhaps wealth was increasingly accumulated by a handful of the local chieftains, who began to dominate wider local areas, with lesser chieftains in their tower Nuraghes subservient to them. It might be that Sardinia's connections to the late Bronze Age international trade networks were better exploited by some chiefs who grew richer than their neighbours. Archaeologists say these were chieftain-level leaders, rather than great kings that you might see in the Near East or in Mycenaean Greece. But whatever you call them, these people were building some of the most spectacular and enormous fortified structures in the world. Some of these towers were an estimated 20 or even 30 metres high. That's 100 feet. One of the few sites to be thoroughly excavated, dated, interpreted, preserved and eventually turned into a tourist site is Nuragic di Barumini, which just means the Nuraghe at Barumini. It's a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Every site is unique, but this one is special not only because it was once so spectacular, but also because its occupation spans almost the entire Nuragic period and beyond. it was one of those sites that was added to incrementally, with the massive 18.5 metre 3-storey central tower built in perhaps 1600 BC, and later 4 towers with joining walls were built around it. It's one of the sites that actually has a well inside the walls, meaning defenders could have held out against sustained attack, in theory. We don't know what Sardinian warfare actually looked like in practice, but going by the complexity of the defences, I think it must have been pretty sophisticated. Like many other sites, there was a village made up of round huts built around it. Most of the population of Bronze Age Sardinia lived in villages like this, either near to or around a Nuraghe, or by themselves without a Nuraghe. Villages without a Nuraghe might have had a cult centre, like a sacred spring, a sacred well, a Megaron temple, or something like that instead. And then there were big changes in Nuragic Sardinia after about 1200 BC. This was an era of great change across the Mediterranean and Near East, with climatic changes as well as drought and possibly earthquakes and mass migrations by, among others, groups known to us collectively as the Sea Peoples that disrupted or brought down the civilizations of the region in a period known as the Late Bronze Age Collapse. Sardinia was part of the trade networks linking these societies, so disruption to those alone could have wrought huge transformations on the island. But it's also thought that one of the Sea People groups, the horned helmet-wearing Sherden, were from Sardinia. A mass exodus of Sardinian chieftains and warriors, either as an invasion force, as pirates or mercenaries, would have changed Nuragic society, especially if thousands of them were killed in the Eastern Mediterranean, never to return. Or as some people argue, it's possible that the Sherden were from somewhere else originally, and instead invaded Sardinia at this time and gave their name to the island. Either way, 1200 BC sees the start of the decline of the Nuraghe, and the growth of these types of villages throughout Sardinia. As the villages grew, so the Nuraghe seem to have been used more for storage of grain and maybe for animals. As well as storing barley, they might have used the Nuraghe for processing and cooking the grain or for brewing beer. In the villages, they also start building structures that have been named meeting rooms or rotundas, with benches all around the inside of the circular wall, and they can have these central basins in the middle. We don't know, but the basin could have held beer or wine for a collective drinking rite. Some see these as a new form of religious building. Nuragic Sardinia had many types of sacred sites, while others see them as serving a socio-political function. Maybe the old powerful elites weren't around anymore, and instead representatives from each family in the village ruled via a village council or something. Or maybe they served both functions at once. After about 1000 BC, as the island enters the Iron Age, you see a further decline in Nuragic society. The population was smaller, and the Phoenicians occupied coastal sites after about 900 BC, and use of the Nuraghe changes again. They still used them for storage and perhaps other economic purposes, but they also seem to become religious sites too. The people living around them carved stone models of the Nuraghe and cast bronze models of them too. These they sometimes deposited inside the Nuraghe, along with many other bronze models of people, animals and ships as votive offerings. It seems that they were leaving offerings to their mighty ancestors. All societies have periods where they grow, stagnate, decline, and perhaps change beyond all recognition. There were many societies like this. I think immediately of the pyramids of Egypt or those of the Maya. The people were still there long after they'd been built, and knew that their ancestors had built them, but they didn't and couldn't build them anymore. Perhaps these late Nuragic people, building small huts with small stones, were in awe of the great structures their forefathers could build, and revered them as ancestors more capable than they were. There was never any sharp break when all the Nuraghe and their surrounding villages were abandoned, however. Although most were left unrepaired, some continued to be occupied by Sardinians, Carthaginians or Romans after the Carthaginian conquests around 500 BC, and even after the Roman conquest in 238 BC during the First Punic War. Some people continued to live in Nuraghe village sites until the 6th century AD, or maybe even later, as the towers continued to be used as barns and stables. It's incredible actually that the dry stone walls were so well built that many still stand today to the heights they do. The ability of the mortarless stones to shift and flex in response to heat, cold and earthquakes has helped them survive millennia. When Christianity spread on the island, churches were sometimes built next to the ancient Nuraghe, even mimicking their circular forms and reusing the stones. The Nuraghe themselves were also Christianized by being given the names of Christian saints. So in a way, their religious and cultural influence continued into the modern era. And today, the Nuraghe continue to be a symbol of Sardinia's incredible, unique history. To me, these are some of the most incredible structures in world history, and in form and function are in some ways thousands of years ahead of their time. And in my view, they do deserve to be called proto-castles. Thanks again to Saley for sponsoring the video. Please hit the link in the description to get your 15% discount now. Thank you very much indeed to my patrons and channel members. Now, to find out more about the Nuragic Civilization and prehistoric Sardinia, please watch this video now. Thank you for watching.